as Open RAN, as a sort of general thing, as a sort of movement or whatever, a concept, provided a bit of a spur for your company? Does it make things more interesting being able, because people often talk about that in that context, don't they? They talk about Open RAN being deployed first, maybe in private enterprise or small cells, and being able to take advantage of some of that stuff is,
yeah. So I guess small cells is, because it's lower scale in individual deployment, it's relatively simpler than macro.
Yeah.
But yeah, very much Open RAN underpins everything we do, because it provides more interfaces that we can then start to look at how we can optimize, add our own special sauce to. I know you like the term special sauce.
and then this is what we get for having someone who listens to the pod on the pod.
Yeah.
Start throwing our cliches back at us. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. The last one you're going to hear from us for quite a while, because we're all going to go off and attempt to have summer holidays. Well, by the sounds of it, it's taking about 5 hours to get through Dover at the moment, so we'll see how that goes. Are you going over the channel, Pierre?
I'm going to Sicily, yeah.
Ah, Sicily, your favourite spot in Sicily.
Yeah.
But not
flying on Sunday, so hopefully.
Flying on Sunday. Yeah, so I'm going to go off, basically a week today, I'm going off to Suffolk for a week, and then when we come back from that, then we're going to attempt to go to the Canaries for 2 weeks. And I'm just thinking, everyone's sort of striking, or they're short of baggage handlers, or shit's getting cancelled, or we might test negative for coronavirus. It's one of those things where I'll give myself a sort of 50-50 chance. Sorry, test positive, yeah. 50-50 chance of getting there. Before I carry on prattling, I should announce that we've got a very special guest this week, Mike Ferris, who's the Chief Network Architect for Dense Air. Did I not screw that up?
No, that was good.
And not only is Mike a telecoms figure, a part of the industry, obviously a Chief Network Architect, so we've presumably forgotten more about techie stuff than I'll ever know. But he's also a fan of the pod. So it's really great to have someone who actually listens to the pod on the last one we're going to do for a while. I don't know when the next one's going to be. Maybe late August, something like that.
Yeah. Last week of August.
No, I'm off in August.
You're off for the whole of August?
2.5 weeks of it.
Right. Okay.
But I can come in anyway. I'm not going anywhere.
Okay. All right. Well, it'd be late August or early
I
September.
don't have enough money to go on holiday.
No.
The Informer hasn't given me a pay rise for years.
Oh, hello. That's got that live. Hope you're listening.
Wait, are you guys here the first week of August?
No.
Here for the first week. He's not though.
I'm off for 3 weeks non-stop from next Friday.
And are you here for the last week of August?
I am then, yeah.
No, last week I'm off. But as I say, I could come in anyway.
Okay, so I guess August.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we'll get onto Mike's sort of area of interest as our main segment shortly. But before that, we've got the obligatory talking shit. You haven't opened your beer yet.
Oh no, I'm still.
I should mention actually.
Getting in the mood for it.
So it's not a bribe of the week, but we got a shout out to PR agency Babel because they had their first. They have a roof party at their office, which is not too far from our old office. It's in Fitzrovia. And they have a roof party there, and they haven't had one since 2019 because of the Rona. So it's great to have that there. And, we were all, me, Ian and Andrew were all there. And we were like, I was initially thinking I'll knock it on the head about 9 because obviously we've got a pod tomorrow and all that sort of thing. And then it got to 9 and we hadn't gone yet. And I went to Ian, let's definitely leave at 10. And then we ended up chipping at about midnight, didn't we?
It was midnight.
Yeah, and I didn't get home because the trains were so annoying. I didn't get home till about 2 a.m.
Well, I waited for an Uber for ages and then gave up.
Oh, that again? You're just having no luck with Ubers.
I don't think it's very good anymore. It must be. They've probably got similar problems to everybody else trying to get staff at the moment, I'm guessing. You wouldn't think it would affect something like that as much, maybe.
Perhaps the app has a way of detecting when you're pissed and then no one wants to pick you up.
It might be that, yeah. But it just shows sort of cars driving around and then the times on it keep changing to
maybe your
15
profile
minutes,
is only like
minutes.
2 stars.
Yeah. They've got you down as liability.
Maybe it is that.
But no, that was great fun, and thanks a lot, baby. It was great catching up with all you crazy kids over there. What else? So this is the week of the great UK heat wave, where on Tuesday it hit 40 degrees.
Historical.
Yeah.
I mean, that was just silly. I don't think we dealt with it very well. What we did was open all the windows, but it just felt like like
worse
1,000
outside.
hairdryers were outside.
You don't want to
the
do
house.
that. We
No.
did exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
We opened them at like 7 o'clock in the morning, shut them again at 8:30, shut everything, drew all the curtains on the south side of the house,
Yeah.
and just shut ourselves in
And
for the day.
did that keep it quite bearable?
I think on the Monday, the temperature inside went up from 24 to 25.5 over the course of the day. And outside it was 37.
We completely
Yeah.
fucked that one up.
Yeah, if you're like, oh, let's open the windows, it's 26 inside, but it's 38
Yeah, I
outside.
know. Look, clearly we didn't think it through
Thermodynamics.
very well. But it's just instinct, you know. When it's hot, you open the windows to get some breeze coming through. But when the
It's an
breeze is
English-
hot,
We're not very well practiced at this.
no,
37 degrees sharp.
we didn't deal with it very well at all. So there we are. And you know, it kind of like today is like a normal English summer day, like early 20s, cloudy. And I've never appreciated the shit English summer more than after sitting in my house when it's 40 degrees centigrade, and I'd botched the mitigation efforts.
I was at the Farnborough Air Show on Monday, Tuesday.
Wow.
Yeah, on
How
the
was it?
tarmac.
Oh my God.
It was interesting. There was like a air conditioned place to hide, but oh my God. Like that moment when you open the door, it's like,
Yeah.
went from like 20 to like 40. It's
Yes.
incredible.
Yeah, no, it's... well, you never know. I mean, obviously, all the sort of global warming types sort of got all their portentous, the end is nigh narrative out.
Yeah.
And if they're right, and this happens more regularly, I'm definitely going to go for a different strategy next time. Cause,
But it was only like 100 degrees in Fahrenheit. So Americans are like, you think that's hot?
yeah, well,
That's
let alone
isn't it?
let alone Africans,
Yeah.
South
I think
Americans,
Portugal, it's been
Indonesia.
47 for
Middle
days.
East.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I know, but we're just not. Our buildings aren't cut out for it. Our buildings are designed to keep heat in,
I know.
not let it out.
But you've been in hot countries before where they're not really designed to cope with it either as well. It's not like you go to Guatemala and find lots of air
Yeah.
conditioning.
Well, you talk about
you know.
Guatemala. That I think the worst experience like that I've ever had was when I was backpacking around Mexico,
Yeah.
and I stayed in a place called Palenque, which is just right near
Yeah,
Guatemala.
I think we talked about it because I've done the same
Yeah,
thing.
and
it is hot there.
and it's sort of sea level, but inland, surrounded by rainforest, no breeze. We were
Yeah.
staying in shitty little entry level accommodation, and you would just try and sit still
Yeah.
to not.
The
completely
worst
sweat
I've
the
ever
whole
been in was Greece, actually. During a heat wave in Greece years
Right,
ago when it was
imagine.
about 45 and we were in a flat with like my wife's sister's boyfriend at the time, didn't have any aircon or anything. It was just really unpleasant because quite a few of us in there as well. But,
Yeah.
But
No, it's not good. Do you know, actually, there's one innovation I did come up with, which was sort of fleetingly effective, which is, those little sort of plant feeder bottles that you just do a spray of
Oh, yeah.
water from them.
On the fan.
Yeah, you just, or on yourself,
Yeah.
and then put the fan on you. But it only lasts about 5 seconds.
Yeah.
you just sit there squirt it all day long.
Yeah,
just
indeed.
get somebody else. You could pay like a 16-year-old to do that. Pay the minimum wage and just have them do that.
You
all
can
day
buy
long.
like an atomizer on Amazon. Yeah, the one like, that's why you...
I don't think there's all sorts of problems with paying children to spray you. I think I might just give that a miss.
I just got visions of It Ain't Half Hot Mum with the
Ostrich feather,
Yeah.
or whatever. Yeah,
that's how you need to set your house up.
yeah, quite. That's clearly Ian aspires to have some kind of waller
Eating grapes.
wafting him with ostrich feathers.
Yeah, exactly.
You've got a bit of a sort of Cleopatra thing going on. Okay, so that was the weather, and it's now a bit more normal, and hurrah for that, and we'll see how the summer goes. What else do we have to chat about? We actually, one thing, talking about the weather, this isn't a segment, but it's like a pre-segment, a bit like we did last week, is, and it's sort of consistent with me referring to the Twitter exchange I had with Danielle Royston, which is I took great pleasure in writing that a couple of public cloud data centers melted in the heat.
Yeah.
Which enabled me to sort of labour my point about putting all your eggs in one basket is a bit high risk. So you presumably, as a regular listener to the pod, you've heard us banging on about our reservations about the public
I
cloud.
certainly have.
Yeah.
Well, I'm guessing it caused problems for other data centers as well. Why would it just be?
Well, yeah, moving to
You know,
public
sort of-
cloud doesn't make that the risk of the data center burning up in the heat.
Yeah.
No, your own
Well,
private
I'm
ones
just
would still do
thinking,
that,
like,
Exactly,
for other
yeah.
companies, ones that telecom companies with private cloud infrastructure, weren't there any reports of that being sort of affected.
Not that I was aware of, but I could be guilty of cherry picking to prove my point.
I mean, I agree with you in a way,
sometimes
because if
do.
it all goes wrong at one centre where there's a
Yeah.
lot of reliance there, which the public cloud is not just
Yeah.
looking after one company, unlike a private cloud. But
Yeah, I think the question I had about, I mean, look, shit happens, and I'm sure, as we keep stressing, whenever we talk about the likes of AWS, Google Cloud or whatever, I'm sure they're excellent at what they do.
Yeah.
But it still kind of surprises me that this data centre, which is presumably quite important,
yeah,
didn't have enough air conditioning capacity or redundancy or just robust enough kit to be able to handle an exceptional spike in temperature.
yeah. No, I'm not disputing your point, because I think
Yeah.
there's a systemic thing there when you've got one company that is looking after lots of others, basically.
Yeah.
But I'm just interested, actually, were there other sort of telecom issues or issues with telecom equipment or private
I didn't
clouds
hear
or
of
anything
anything.
like
Did you
that?
hear
I didn't read anything.
No, I didn't.
But there's a
But
lot
I'm
of
sure
stuff
other
about- it
smaller
wasn't
data
just
centres melted.
There were lots of other sort of infrastructure issues, weren't there? I mean, the train tracks in this country apparently don't withstand anything above 27 degrees very well. So they sort of have problems.
Well, the trains,
Or an inch of snow.
as someone who has to get the train into town, and I was nearly late for this, Mike, because the one I was going to get, they just cancelled. And they just cancelled, and they just come up with the most generic stuff. They just basically said, cancel because we haven't got anyone to drive the fucking train. Like that's some kind of extenuating circumstance.
That's usually the excuse these days.
I know,
though,
but,
because-
if it was like lightning struck the pylons or something,
Yeah.
some act of God, but all they're really saying is trains are cancelled because we're shit at running trains.
Bob is hungover.
Well, it's the
Yeah.
same as why flights are getting cancelled, though, isn't it? We haven't got any people to move your bags around.
Yeah, well,
or
there's
stuff.
that.
So,
There is that.
it's
But looking at the development of data center infrastructure, because it's something that I've been involved with over the years. When long time ago, I worked for Orange in its early days, and we built all these switch centers, which we put all our equipment in for the core network. And as things evolved and packet networks came in, and we started to deploy very different type of equipment, we looked at, how do we need to adapt these sites? And just moving from racks and racks of like Nokia or Ericsson 2G equipment that consumes small amount of power per unit and churns out a relative amount of heat from that, the miniaturization means that what you've got to pump into the rack in terms of power, presents a lot of challenges in trying to get enough power into the building. And then equally, you've got the same problem trying to disperse the heat that produces. Now, that problem's getting worse and worse. And I know we were chatting earlier about the advancement in the process of
shrinking the
shrinking the silicon.
yeah.
But that doesn't get over the fact that in a unit volume, you're still generating more heat than you were before.
Indeed, because you've got more transistors per area.
yeah.
So that I thought I flagged that up. Oh, one other thing. In fact, this is sort of relevant to having someone on the pod who also listens to it. You bumped into someone on the tube. The week.
Well, I was on the tube on Saturday with my youngest son.
Yeah.
Going out to some skateboarding park,
Okay.
and then some bloke apprehended me, and I thought he was going to. Usually, those sort of people ask for directions, don't they? Or maybe money.
Or drugs.
And then he's like, "You're on the Telecoms.com podcast, aren't you?"
God damn.
And he's like, "Yeah, I'm a really big fan. I'm in Dubai. I watch it from Dubai." And I mean,
It's amazing, isn't it?
he looked like he was in a bit of a hurry. I think he was with his family as well, and
But
we
he
were going
still took the
somewhere.
time to
So sort of
groupie your
shook
ass.
his hand and said, "Thanks for watching."
Yeah.
And felt
I mean, that's-
like a bit like a celebrity.
Felt
So
like it was
thanks to the guy in Dubai for watching.
Well,
and,
maybe in a very constrained and narrow way, we are celebrities now.
It's funny because I think we've had people at trade shows that have come
Yeah.
up to us because some people do watch it and know what we look like.
yeah.
For
No, it's
someone
always nice.
on the London Underground to run it to me.
I know, that
and
is-
it's not
That's
like
That's extra.
So I didn't do that, Ian, when I saw you at a trade show, because I thought you won't know me from Adam.
oh,
But it's
You've
been
seen
in
him
the
across
same
the room at
Yeah,
Mobile
yeah,
Congress
yeah.
or something like that, have you?
It was some 5G event in the middle of last year when
Yeah.
it was at the Excel. We were just
remember.
starting
Oh, right, the
Yeah.
informal one.
just
yeah.
starting to
5G World.
unwind from the lockdowns,
Yeah.
and you had to show your COVID passport when you went in and all that.
5G World
I
coming to
remember-
Amsterdam
I
this year in October.
Otherwise known as Network X.
Yes.
Indeed.
.com. No, I don't know.
Okay. So, I mean, that's all I've got to say, other than to say that if you're watching this on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook, you can also listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and loads of other podcasting platforms. And Producer Pierre, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yes, a shout out to Richard and Evan because they like when I do the City of the Month.
Okay.
So the podium is very weird. First city by a mile is Lima in Peru. Then we have Mississauga, sorry, in Canada. I'm probably butchering that name. And then Sydney. That's more of a normal one. But
It's funny how it moves around the world, isn't
yeah,
it? Because sometimes we've had.
Lima is pretty cool.
Oh my God, what is that? That's big.
This is one Mike brought. So Mike, knowing the protocol of the pods, you brought 8 beers. Fair play to you, mate.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and so I'm having one of Mike's. This is, what's this called? Wild Beer.
Mm.
The Wild Beer Company.
Wild Beer Everstone Hazy NZ, which I presume means New Zealand IPA.
It looks
Doesn't change. The hops
looks
are from New
radioactive almost.
6%?
It's 5.8, I think.
Mm.
It even looks like it's got a scorpion on it or something. It's not. Is that a? It's not a scorpion. I just can't see it from
It's a
here.
deer.
Let's review
What
it.
is it?
It's a deer. It's called wild.
A deer or a steer. I'm not sure which. No, it's
Stag.
a deer.
Yeah.
It's quite good, though, isn't it?
Yeah. It's more sort of robust, more hoppy than like the Hazy Jane.
I didn't go for the 12% like you had a couple of months
Oh
ago.
God, yeah, that was
That must be like treacle.
It
Jeff.
was.
that was Jeff from Rakuten Symphony, wasn't it?
So this
Right.
stuff,
Yeah, that was pretty minging, if I'm honest.
it's 5 point something.
Sorry, Jeff.
Can't find
He
it.
knew.
5.8 this is.
Yeah, it's
so it's quite
5.8.
robust.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think anything above 6 is.
We got to say, so we talked about the Babel thing at the start. Ian, you were feeling pretty rough this morning, weren't you?
Really bad.
It wasn't that bad. I'm a bit knackered because I only got about 4 or 5 hours kit.
I think this is 2 Fridays in a row where I've not really felt well.
Right.
So we've got to stop doing these Thursday
Things. Well, we just don't know how to fucking do it in moderation, do we?
It's just a bad influence on
Just
each
hang
other.
on. Well, the problem with drinking is you get to a certain stage of pissness where drinking more just seems like the best idea ever.
Bad decisions, yeah.
Yeah, and you start having silly drinks. They had some guy mixing cocktails. I was like, yeah, I'll try one of them.
And then you mix all the alcohol.
Yeah, exactly.
For some reason, I thought I'd get 2 of them at the same time.
Yeah.
I was planning on giving one to somebody else, but
And then you
I
just chugged it.
it.
Dear, oh dear.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So I think we're good to go, aren't we? So, okay, Mike, let's sort of introduce you more fully. Why don't we start by learning a little bit about your company, Dentsair? I must admit, outside of the context of knowing you and arranging this podcast, it's not a company I'd encountered. That's almost certainly a failing of mine. But why don't you educate me? Why should I know more about it?
Well, I've only been at Dentsair for a little under 6 months, but I knew of it before I was looking around, and it was actually formed as it was kind of incubated by Airspan. You've heard of Airspan?
Mm.
They're a small cell vendor,
Right.
So it started life
Stuff for Rakuten,
as a vehicle for acquiring spectrum. So it was Airspan Spectrum Holdings, I think.
Okay.
Before the brand Dentsair came about. But that's ancient history now. And I should emphasise, because it does come up even now, people think that we're still associated with Airspan. We're not.
Okay,
Right.
completely separate thing.
So
So,
Airspan's a US company, yeah?
yeah,
And
yeah.
is Dentsair UK based or?
It's UK based, but
Yeah.
I'll come on to
Okay.
ownership because it's a little bit of a story. So there was an investment.
Stop messing with his narrative, Ian.
There was an investment by SoftBank some years ago, at a time when they were diversifying their portfolio, if you'll remember.
Yeah.
And then last year they started undiversifying it.
Yeah. Because
trying
they
to sell
started
Arm,
losing
weren't they?
tons of money.
Yeah.
And in the process, they sold Dentsair to a company called SIP, or Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners.
That sounds quite American.
Which is American, yeah.
Sidewalk.
Yeah, and they have an initiative called Ko-Fi, which is looking at kind of trying to tackle the digital divide in through a mobile infrastructure initiative. And so that was how they became interested in Dentsair, because we are in the game of building and operating mobile infrastructure on behalf of mobile operators or other tenants, so private and public entities.
Right.
And they saw...
So we talk about like OpenReach being a wholesaler or something like that.
Yeah, we would be. We're wholesaling capacity, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we don't really sell direct to consumers.
Yeah.
We sell
Okay.
capacity on our solutions to other companies who own the end user relationship.
Right.
But you're not an operator yourself.
Well, we are licensed, and we've acquired spectrum.
Yeah.
So in the SoftBank phase, we went through the process of acquiring spectrum in a number of markets. So we've got 7 opcos, New Zealand being one, which is why I picked up this beer. Thought nod to my New Zealand
That's a good
colleagues.
one. Well done, New Zealand.
Hope they listen. I don't know actually. I'll have to check.
They're still getting over getting beaten by Ireland at home.
Maybe.
In the rugby.
Maybe. So we acquired spectrum. Got some in Ireland. And
is that part of auctions like big operators get involved in?
Yeah, absolutely. Had a look at the UK, but it was a bit expensive.
Right.
So we didn't acquire any in the. I think it was the 3.4 to 3.6 gig auction a couple of years ago. But since we've been acquired by SIP, which completed in December last year, there's been a very much a different focus and a lot more ambition to do something meaningful. We're very 5G focused right now. So we've done a number of trials and pilots of our 4G technology over the last few years, and we've got some good relationships with some MNOs and with some councils and some private enterprise stuff going on in our 7 operating companies.
I mean, this might be me having just berated Ian for interrupting your flow. This could be me doing it. But when you say you provide infrastructure, you make infrastructure and then sort of rent it out or whatever. What form does this infrastructure take?
So we deploy small cells.
Right.
For private networking, we provide our own core network.
Okay.
And we have some capabilities that provide a multi-tenancy capability on a single carrier. So if you look at the network sharing models that we've got, for example, in the UK today, so the likes of MBNL and Cornerstone, they're mainly passive sharing models. So you share a tower, you share the power and aircon and the stuff that you use to operate the site. You might share backhaul, although sharing anything active can be tricky.
Yep.
In some cases, you might share the RAN infrastructure but have your own carrier. So that means you're using your own spectrum. So these guys have bought national spectrum licenses. They're using their own spectrum, but some of the infrastructure might be shared. So there's something called MoRAN, which is a multi-operator RAN. It's not standardized by 3GPP, but there's a number of companies that offer it, and it means that you can share some of the equipment, which is cheaper than building your own your own base station.
Share the base stations and
yeah, but you're only sharing part of it because you've got your own carrier, so you've got your own radio units essentially.
But with what you're doing, is it possible to share the carrier? Will you say?
Yeah. So there's a feature in 3GPP called MOCN, which is multi-operator core network. Doesn't mean what you might assume it does. It's a bit of a misnomer. So that is a capability where you have a single carrier, but you connect it to 2 core networks.
Yeah.
So you can broadcast both networks on the same carrier. So you're saving on equipment because you've only got one radio, but you can support the customers of multiple operators.
Okay.
So we've got some of that capability in 4G already. We're developing it for 5G.
It all sounds quite 5G-ish when you're talking about small cells, talking about private networks. A lot of these are quite sort of buzzwordy terms in the current generation. Is that how you see it, that you're sort of optimized for 5G?
Well, I think it's a timing thing, right? So we want, as a neutral host operator, we need to be able to differentiate ourselves in the market, because although neutral host has gone under the radar for some years, we don't talk about it.
Likely gone under my radar.
Yeah, we don't talk about it a lot in telecoms news stories, but it's been bubbling under,
right,
for some time. Forgotten where I was going with this now.
Well, I was just asking you. I was just saying some of the terms you come up with seem quite contemporary, seem quite sort of aligned with a lot of the buzzwords we hear around 5G. And you were saying that some of that's just sort of timing.
Yeah, so it's timing for us because we are, we're not going to be launching product even into pilots until the end of next year.
Okay.
So it's really as the 2024 timescale for big scale rollout. So it gives us time to develop capability and to do some of our own stuff on top of what comes out of the manufacturers, radio and other software stacks and the like.
So is the target market sort of, an enterprise customer perhaps who wants to, have a small cell build out, but not have its own spectrum and not have, they could basically do a service, sign up to a service with you and they're running it over your spectrum, and then you could have somebody else that's sharing a part of that as well in the same area.
So the key thing is, if you want to build a private network today, you can do it yourself. You can go and acquire some spectrum. I mean, in the UK, there is spectrum set aside for that. So there's the 3.8 to 4.2 gig spectrum, which is kind of shared access. You can get a license locally just for one small cell if you want, or over a small geographic area. You can do that yourself, or you can go to systems integrator or somebody and say, can you build me a network? You do it all. But you're still building a network for that private use case. So you're absorbing all of the cost in the private network. And what we're trying to do, and other neutral hosts are looking at as well, is to build and then lease that out to multiple tenants, which can include private enterprise, but also can include public operators.
And why would an operator do to help them with capacity or fill not spots? Or
it's about filling not spots.
Right.
So you guys have talked at length about the challenges with the higher frequencies in 3G.
Right.
I mean, that you haven't got the same footprint that you've got for 4G, and so using the same grid of macrocells, you end up with a lot of missing coverage. And to try and get a ubiquitous 5G coverage, you need to fill that in somehow. And what we're trying to do is to bring a new model to market that will allow you to do that more efficiently.
So that seems, if what you're talking about is a sort of network of small cells for hire, it seems quite capex intensive. I mean, you'd have to build out sites.
And that's part of the reason, because we're seeing operators shying away from capex, aren't we? Like selling off their towers.
Yeah. Selling the family jewels.
They're moving more to an OpEx model. So we're kind of jumping on that bandwagon. It's an opportunity.
Right,
So you've got the funding from the private equity, it sounds like, but in investment fund that's backing you. And how does it work? Do you sort of sign up, do you have anchor tenants that give you the security to go ahead with the deployment, or are you sort of just taking a bit of a risk and build it and they'll come?
A bit of both. Yeah, it is. It is a bit, to some extent, it's build it and they will come. But something else we've got in our armory is some big data analytics. So we've got some self-built software called Denseware, which we've had for some time, and that won an award last year at the Small Cell Awards last year. So it's a successful piece of work, and that takes crowdsourced data from actual network measurements from devices, and it collates all that, and it can do some machine learning type stuff, and then to tell us where are there coverage not spots and where is there demand that's not really being served, because we can see things like the signal to noise ratio and start to build a geographic picture of where would be a good place to put small cell coverage, because the demand's there, it's just not being served.
Yeah.
Cool.
And it sounds like the higher spectrum stuff's quite important, which, the sort of 26, whatever it is, gigahertz and up at that millimeter wave range. I mean, does that make it a slightly big, because some of that's not even been thought about, has it, outside America? I know Verizon made a big fuss about it, and then it didn't really work, and everybody went, oh, you can't use millimeter wave, but you obviously can, but it just has to be done in a certain way.
You can, but you can't build a coverage layer with millimeter wave. You can address hot spots of demand. So it's really going to be
airport stadiums.
Very high footfall, high density areas where, and I mean, really, you need line of sight for millimeter wave. So that's not going to be an answer to try and serve in-building problems with an outside-in
Yep.
approach.
So the spectrum you've got in these, is it 7 markets you said that you're in, would be
We've got
the
7 opcos, yeah.
would be the sort of
Mid-band.
mid-band, yeah, the 3.5 or whatever it is to 4 roughly.
Yeah, so in the UK, for example, we're using the 3.8 to 4.2 gig
Okay.
band because that's available
Yeah.
That's
on a
licensed, is
local
it?
basis. Yeah.
Right.
This is the local stuff where you can get, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you can buy quite low cost licenses, can't you,
Yes.
to just cover a tiny area, like an office even or something.
Oh, right. I didn't know that.
Yeah, like it's 50-metre radius is the...
Yeah. So it was the
smallest
Ofcom's
license.
attempt to sort of, do something a little bit similar to what Germany's done in reserving spectrum
Yeah.
for non-telco kind of people.
Yeah.
But it seems to be a bit more flexible in a way. I don't. Although I probably don't know enough about the German
Yeah,
system to comment.
And then in the US, you've got the CBRS band,
Yeah.
where equally you can acquire spectrum. I mean, even unlicensed spectrum you can acquire.
And you can't do it near airports, or it makes the planes fall out of the sky, apparently.
Just one coronavirus.
Yeah.
The Rona.
And the not spots that are being filled. I mean, do you see demand coming mainly for consumer stuff, or is it more about some of these, whizzier and wackier use cases that get talked about?
So we get kind of blinded by what we see in the UK, don't we? Because we all live in the UK and we see. I think not all markets are the same, and I think in the US the coverage footprint in cities is I think quite different. I think they have quite wide areas of low income where there's no real money to fund network build. So you end up with large areas of lack of coverage where there's actually a lot of people, but they
Right.
just haven't got they're just not buying the contracts to make the operators go and build. But the problem then is that things like healthcare and education, where the where the local councils are trying to bridge the digital divide and provide capabilities to people who haven't got high income, there's no network to do it with. So we can go in and build a network to meet that demand in partnership with the local authority. And then once that's built, we can invite the operators on and say, well, we've built this now. Do you want to come on? And then they can pay for the capacity that's consumed by the users that are paying. And if it's,
So it seems like a very contemporary sort of model, very much sort of dynamic sort of commercial arrangement where people just pay for what they use when they need it and that sort of thing. I guess one of the commercial risks. I know you're the chief network architect, not the CEO or the head of sales or whatever. But I would have thought a commercial risk is, of course, that you do all this and then these people who you think might use it still can't be bothered for whatever reason. That's the build it and they will come risk, isn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, obviously we're going to run pilots and we're going to, prove in the field what actually happens. We've done some stuff in 4G, as I already said, and we've had some pilots live for some time where we've proven to operators that we've been working with what we can do to bring them new traffic, and also that we've been looking at cell edge issues where you've got users who are hanging on to a tiny bit of coverage, dragging down the capacity of the cell because they're using very low modulation, which consumes more resources, and they're getting bugger all throughput. So you put a small cell in on the edge of coverage with a strong uplink because it's not a handheld device. It's got bigger antennas. It's got much more gain, and you can position it using our denseware big data analytics. Position it in the right location to get a good strong uplink, and then you can offload customers onto the small cell with much better
It makes sense.
modulation
does the
and
equipment come
throughput.
It would come from sort of the traditional vendors that operators buy their stuff from, or are you more sort of involved in the equipment side yourself, or are you getting it from a different place entirely? Or
We're working with some small cell vendors.
yeah, who I don't know much about at all, small cell vendors actually. But
Well, I mean,
sort of-
the big kit vendors dabble in small cells as well, but I don't know about specialist ones. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we still work with Airspan because we were
Yeah.
born out of Airspan, and we've got some we've got an ongoing relationship with them, even though we're no longer directly associated. But there are others that we work with as well. I have to be careful.
Yeah,
I say.
totally. No,
There's not much
don't say any more than you're comfortable with.
Yeah, sure. But obviously we're not going to start making our own radios.
Yeah.
But what we are going to do is to work with partners to tailor what they are offering to our particular use case, and we're going to build some of our own software capability potentially on top to optimize how we can roll out the solution and orchestrate it and make the whole thing as easy as possible. The densification of networks is going to be very highly reliant on automation and being able to turn the handle easily.
Right.
And how long have we been talking about small cells? We were talking about them in 3G days, right?
Indeed.
Before we even had 4G.
And then we had things like femto cells. Yeah,
I remember. Yeah.
Well, femto cells are a bit different.
Yeah, they're like sort of individual premise sort of signal boost type of things. Wasn't that the
Well,
point
that's
of them?
how I understood it, but maybe.
Yeah. You connect them to your broadband router, and they use the internet for backhaul,
Right.
and then they just give you a predominantly still 3G signal
Right.
in your home where you don't have one.
But yes, you're right. We have been doing, and we should mention the other hat you wear is that you're a board member of the Small Cell Forum. Is that right?
I am. Yes.
So why do we need a small cell forum? Is that what happens? You all get together and chat about small cells down the pub?
Not down the pub, no. The Small Cell Forum started life as the Femto.
Oh, there we go.
Right.
So, Femtos were the first example of a small cell.
Femto forum sounds a bit more snappy to me.
Yeah, but it's not
Tell 'em-
accurate, is it?
Sounds change it back. I like it.
But it's more than that. I mean, a small cell, I think they define the small cell as anything that's 5 watts or under.
Right.
But femtocells are like 250 milliwatts.
Okay.
So is it like the Small Cell Forum is kind of like a standards group, or is that the wrong way to think of it? I mean,
Think of it in the same vein as you think of the O-RAN Alliance.
Right,
It's not
okay.
it's not as big, but it's been around a lot longer.
Yeah.
They do develop specifications. There's the FAPI specification, which is usually an internal interface between femtocell systems. And I think what they were trying to do originally was to try to bring together the companies that wanted to build femtocells and those that wanted to build components for femtocells and try and get some sort of alignment as to how the architecture of a femtocell evolved and to try and have some standard kind of internal interfaces so that you could start to mix and match and get some better economies of scale. But since O-RAN has come into thinking, then some of those interfaces that started off internal within the system are now looking at like external interfaces where you've got like a radio unit and a distributed unit and they've got to talk to each other. So what the Small Cell Forum called FAPI then became Network FAPI or NFAPI, which is the network version. So you can connect a radio and a distributed unit that are not physically in the same device.
So you have quite a lot to do with the O-RAN Alliance as a result of this?
There is liaison, definitely. But we have our own agenda, obviously.
Yeah. And these are things that the 3GPP has sort of kind of ignored, overlooked, because it's not sort of been focused on some of these specific issues, I guess.
So 3GPP, if you look at the 3GPP 5G system architecture, the three domains you've got to worry about are the core network, the RAN, which in the 5G system architecture is just called next generation RAN. It doesn't even have any boxes in it. It's kind of it's a single box
Right.
Yeah.
solution as it was in 4G. And then you've got the UE or the user equipment, the device, the CPE, whatever it is. And what 3GPP is most concerned about is making those three things talk to each other in a standard way. So everything they define in terms of interfaces and protocols and what have you is really focused on those three domains working together. Now, obviously, in the 5G core, we've gone cloud native, and there's lots of different network functions that potentially you can take from off the shelf from different companies, and they've all got service-based interfaces, and they can all talk to each other, and that's become a very different thing from a 3G core, where it's all very proprietary.
Yeah.
But yeah, 3GPP is really worried about the three domains and making those interoperate.
Okay.
But then O-RAN Alliance and Small Cell Forum are kind of breaking apart that RAN and looking at what can we do to optimize it for scale and interoperability and bringing more players into the market. So there's quite a lot of overlap in terms of companies that belong to both.
Yeah.
We only belong to the Small Cell Forum at the moment, but we're looking at O-RAN Alliance as well.
So as Open RAN, as a sort of general thing, as a sort of movement or whatever, a concept, provided a bit of a spur for your company? Does it make things more interesting being able, because people often talk about that in that context, don't they? They talk about Open RAN being deployed first, maybe in private enterprise or small cells, and being able to take advantage of some of that stuff is,
yeah. So I guess small cells is, because it's lower scale in individual deployment, it's relatively simpler than macro.
Yeah.
But yeah, very much Open RAN underpins everything we do, because it provides more interfaces that we can then start to look at how we can optimize, add our own special sauce to. I know you like the term special sauce.
and then
this is what we get for having someone who listens to the pod on the pod.
Yeah.
Start throwing our cliches back at us.
Yeah. Does the the sort of systems integration job that goes with Open RAN, you get operators who are bigger operators, ones not sort of focused on small cells, expressing concern about that or saying they need to get somebody in to help them with it. But how do you sort of approach that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's an interesting debate. And I think it is potentially an order of magnitude harder in the macro layer. And I think a lot of the debate's been about, will Open RAN really make any inroads in 5G? And it's because we're still focused as an industry on the macro rollout for 5G, because that's where all the big bucks are being spent now. And you guys have rightly challenged whether O-RAN will take a slice, or whether it's going to become a 6G thing. That we'll get it right next time.
Yeah,
we'll do all the hard work and work out how we need to do it, and then it'll deliver in 6G.
Yeah, I think they even had a 6G announcement, didn't they? Sort of 2 or 3 weeks ago, I seem to remember. Adding, there was some O-RAN Alliance update on 6G where they're talking about adding 6G specifications, but it's obviously very early days.
I think the opportunities in small cells are very much more real for 5G, because who's done a mass 5G small cell rollout? Nobody.
Yeah.
No, and yet
it's still to be done.
And yet I always thought, in my much more sort of simplistic understanding of the technology, I always thought it was strongly implied by the fact that so much mid-band is flying around in 5G where it wasn't before. I always assumed that meant more small cells, because of course the mid-band's got poorer propagation characteristics.
They talk about it, but
less range. Anything. But I don't see how, if you acquire a shitload of mid-band spectrum, I don't see how you make use of it without a load of small cells. Am I missing something there?
Well, that's maybe one of the reasons why coverage isn't that good.
Yeah. No, it's fair.
What are we at, 50% or something in the, the country that's really, really gone ahead on 5G is South Korea, as I understand it, where they have a very dense network.
Yeah.
If you look at
and most people live in one city.
100,000, well, I think that's the way of measuring it according to Deloitte, and it's much, much higher in South Korea than it is in the UK.
So they've got a lot more small cells, are we saying that, or they've just got more?
They've got a
denser
macro network. The grid the grid that they were using for 3G and 4G sort of maps quite well still. You don't get that sort of cell edge problem that was being chatted about. But you ask the operators what they're thinking of doing with densification. I've asked people at Orange this and BT, and you don't get very straight answers. It's like they seem to think they can use technology advances to do with beamforming and stuff to try and overcome some of those problems, but I'm not sure how.
Well, they're having to, aren't they?
Yeah.
I think, Asia is Southeast Asia is somewhat different to Europe. In the UK, for example, in London, it's notoriously difficult to get a new rooftop site up and running, even just acquiring the right.
There's recently been some litigation about that, the tension between the operators and the landowners and all that sort of thing. No, I don't think it was litigation, it was actual law they passed some new laws that basically force I think from the landowner's perspective, they will be moaning because they sort of force them into arbitration and kind of force them to let operators go there. Because obviously the temptation is you've got a captive market. If you're a landowner and someone's got a base station on your roof or in your field or whatever, and they need to get to it, you've got them over a barrel to a certain degree, haven't you? You can sort of almost charge them what you want. And now these laws have come in that just
Not
don't
anymore.
let them do it. No, quite. So you're familiar with those laws that I was alluding to? I think there've been some court cases.
Yeah, they
I'm
have.
sure.
It's been in the tech news a few weeks ago, or maybe months ago now. But I think the attitudes are very different in different markets. So if you go to, I haven't been to South Korea, but I've been to Japan, and in Tokyo, I mean, it's an earthquake zone, right? So putting fibre underground, for example, is not the done thing. Everything's strung on poles, and the whole
That's it.
thing.
Never
It looks a
even thought
mess.
of that.
Right?
Yeah.
It looks a mess,
know that,
but it's
yeah.
just the
gotta
way
be
it's
done.
always been. It's the
Right.
way it's always been, and the fact that they've got that easy infrastructure for building new fibre networks means that there's loads of fibre
So they've got just tons of cables just going from pole to pole.
strung down all
all
the
over the
streets,
place.
yeah, and they don't think anything of it because it's
No.
just the norm to them. You try to do that in London, you couldn't possibly get away with
As
it.
you could see, yeah.
Well, I associate that more with sort of more developing countries. Like you go to India or whatever, there's fucking wires everywhere, and half of them just look like they're not even insulated. It looks a health and safety disaster waiting to happen. But I for some reason I assumed that was just a developed world versus developing world thing. So it's interesting to hear that that's the norm in Japan. But as you say, with the earthquake aspect, it makes sense.
It just makes things so much easier. And the first time I went was 2012. Well, it's 10 years ago now. And we just sat in a cafe, and we just did a Wi-Fi speed test on the Wi-Fi in the cafe. We got 400 meg.
Right. And that was
10
how long
years
ago?
ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that East Asia's generally been a bit ahead on the game on a lot of telecom stuff, haven't they? Certainly in the last decade or so. I mean, Europe, a bit before my time, I started doing this job 8 years ago, and I wasn't a telecoms-focused tech journalist before that. But, Europe's heyday was like sort of early on, wasn't it? In the sort of 2G, 3G kind of era. And now I just get the impression that the Far East is taken over, or is that a misinterpretation?
Yeah, GSM was born out of Europe, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was a SEPT initiative
Yeah.
originally.
Yeah.
How long have you been in the telecoms game, Mike?
Oh, don't know, more than 25 years.
Right. Okay. So you've seen a generation or two.
I have. It was very early days of 2G when I joined.
Cool.
Is there a bigger sort of opportunity for you, because we were talking about neutral host more generally before we kind of got started, and you made that interesting point that operators don't want to spend a lot on capex these days. They're trying to go more towards an opex model. They've sold off towers. We've seen the emergence of the kind of tower co, haven't we, with someone like Cellnex. So, is there an opportunity for a company like Densair to come along and be a neutral host, not just small cells, but on a sort of wider scale basis? Maybe the operators decide they want to go even further in terms of getting out of
flog their macro cells to a third party.
Well, there's they've sold towers.
Yeah.
They've sold, in some cases, they've spun off fibre assets, haven't
And I
they?
think Cellnex sometimes does.
Talk of the fibre co. So I'm just sort of thinking.
Cellnex sometimes does a lot more than just like the basic passive infrastructure, don't they? They do add a fair bit of value. I don't know if it's servers or backhaul or whatever.
I think all the tower cos are trying to move into more active components, and obviously they're potential neutral hosts as well.
Yeah.
But they may be more focused on the macro side because the tower assets means that's where they play currently. That's where they could potentially leverage their foothold in the market.
So people like Cellnex are sort of looking at doing something like that, where it's not just the towers they own, but they would have, base stations that, that could be shared between, say, BT, Vodafone, and
it could go that way. Cellnex were another contributor on the last paper that the Small Cell Forum put out on neutral hosting. So I co-lead the neutral host workstream at Small Cell Forum. We put a paper out, SCF 245, about a month ago. I think it was released, which was it's called a high-level design for hosted RAN.
Right.
So it's very much aligned to the kind of model we're trying to build at Densair, but Cellnex were a key contributor to that as well. So were Crown Castle in the US.
So they basically, in the same way they've gone and bought up tower assets, they'd to sort of take advantage of that. It would get to the stage where they're buying base stations and active equipment from an operator potentially, and then running it on a sort of neutral host basis.
I think we're going to have to wait and see exactly which models emerge, but Cellnex, as an example, I mean, they're not just in the towers game; they also build DAS solutions.
Yeah, I know they're talking about getting into edge computing as well at a conference recently.
Yeah,
but, yeah,
probably.
So,
but
yeah.
DAS has
anything
active
past them.
components.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that's really interesting. So I think one thing you sort of observed, I think, before we started recording, is that the stuff you're involved with doesn't necessarily get a lot of coverage, and certainly not from me, because to sort of expose the workings of a tech journalist or telecoms journalist, each day typically we're news driven, and we just try and write up the thing that we think people are going to want to read. And conversations like this, in fact, this will lead me on to sort of talking about podcasts in general, because I want to pick your brains about that, as you're a fan. Blatantly fishing for compliments there. But podcasts like this are good for getting in the weeds, like we've just done. But this sort of thing is harder to just write in a sort of 500-word news article. But I've got a feeling it's going to get towards the front pages a little bit more, because, as I was saying earlier, it seems so contemporary. It seems so in keeping with a lot of other trends that we associate with the 5G era, including the spectrum that's used, and then also what we were just talking about, which is this transition by operators to go to basically farm out a lot of stuff they used to do in-house to third parties. So I've got a feeling that we'll be covering this stuff more. Is the name of your company Dense Air? Does that stem from densification as a concept?
I don't know. It could do.
Either that or it's to do with people being thick.
Yeah.
No, I guess it is. I've never asked, actually.
Yeah,
but
it feels like it. Because, when you were talking about the small cells, I mean, that's small cells you associate with densification for sort of coverage and capacity and that sort of
absolutely,
thing.
yeah. The air is dense with mobile
There we go.
coverage.
I think that's it. I think I've nailed it.
I covered our strapline.
Can I just go back into the weeds a bit? Because you mentioned this Mocan thing earlier, which sounds like the sort of...
Mocan,
Yeah, Mocan, not Mocan. Sounds like a coffee or something, but...
Yeah, mocha. Like one of those stupid variety of coffees you can get at Starbucks when all you want is a goddamn coffee.
But this is a sort of technology that you need to do this spectrum carrier sharing, I guess. And I'm just curious about that. I mean, has it not really gone anywhere up to now? Is it at an early stage? Is no one...
It is deployed, actually.
It is deployed, okay.
I think it's quite popular in Canada. I think several of the operators in Canada are using it in the macro layer for their 4G networks. And
so they'd be quite different from the UK operators, where they are sort of sharing base stations, but they've got separate carriers. Still, it sort of takes it a stage further in the Canadian.
Yeah. I mean, if you look back at the history in the UK, and I guess it's the same in some other markets, but because I know about the UK, it's easier to talk about. They've obviously in the 4G era fought very hard based on their spectrum assets as differentiation. So EE and Vodafone spent highly on 4G spectrum. That gave them more to play with in terms of capacity they could build on their networks, and they used that to create the market-beating top-line speeds and throughput performance, because they had the spectrum to do it. And then you had 3 and O2, who had less spectrum assets, who had to go to the market with a different proposition. And they were still successful, but they had a very different. People bought for a different reason.
Yeah.
And because of that spectrum position, the appetite for sharing was never there. And if you look at what happened with the rural issue, where trying to extend coverage to rural not spots, then Ofcom were trying to push the operators into a national roaming type approach, which meant that if you had coverage from one network, you could enable coverage for everybody. But then the problem then is that whoever built that network is then giving it, they're giving it away for free to the others on the basis that they're going to get the same in return somewhere else. But
doesn't it guarantee the reciprocation's going to be perfect?
Well, no, it isn't. And
they've got the costs.
BTE built a load of sites to extend their coverage, to give them a coverage differentiation.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the tenor said, well, no, we don't want to do that. We spent on this. We'll just give it away to our competitors.
Yeah.
So
we haven't just dropped all this cash just to give it away.
Hitting a brick wall. So every time you talk about spectrum sharing in the historical sense, it's been let's just not go there, because it doesn't fit with how we've fought over coverage and capacity in the past. But things are different in 5G. Now we've got new spectrum that neutral hosts can acquire themselves. There's potentially an appetite even in the UK to share spectrum if it's not yours.
Yeah.
So I think we'll see the model evolve in all markets. But everybody looks at what's happening elsewhere, and from the UK we'll look at what's happening with CBRS in the US and see. I mean, it's had a lot of demand, so there's a level of success in that sense. But we have to see if that translates into real benefits to consumers and improving the market overall.
Is that one of the markets you're in?
Yeah, absolutely.
You're in the US market, because that's the big one, I guess, isn't it, with CBRS?
It is, and as I was going to say, SIP is an American company, so we are American owned, even though we operate out of the UK.
Yeah,
and so US is one of our big markets.
I guess this might be something that overlaps with the segment we'll move on to after this. There seems governments are quite into poking their nose into telecoms right now. Certainly for about certainly since Trump started going on about it and hassling Huawei, telecoms has been positioned as this sort of national strategic priority. And that's why people like Trump and the subsequent American administration is saying we got to keep Chinese vendors out of our networks because they're too sensitive and we can't have them spying on us, whatever it is they think they're doing. And there's lots of other ways which we will certainly come on to where governments are sort of poking their nose into being sort of quite proactive. And I could see a time, so you spoke about public-private partnerships. I think you were talking more sort of individual, sort of local cases. But I could see governments just wanting to get behind someone who is a wholesaler, someone who is a neutral, who can help them achieve these political ambitions of coverage targets or just general infrastructure boosts. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting space for you all to be in, because the sky's the limit in terms of the potential demand and potential sort of partners. And because obviously investors, we spoke about this. We did, I don't know if you've heard them. We did a couple of pods recently with guests where we spoke a lot about fibre and how private equity's all flying into that because they think it's a relatively solid investment these days. And why not invest in great big sort of small cell neutral host networks as well? So yeah, it'd be interesting. There seems to be a lot of potential there. So yeah, I approve. You can keep going.
Thank you.
Well, we'll move it on a little bit, just because in the name of time. But let's before we move away from sort of Mike and his stuff as the core focus, I'm just interested. I mean, nearly everyone we've had on the pod has seen the pod. I kind of almost insist, because I don't want them coming on and then being appalled that I'm swearing and drinking beer and talking shit. That's why there's certain, I mean, we don't vet people that rigorously, but I do get a lot of sort of unsolicited people saying, can we get our CEO on your pod? And I'm like, well, it depends. Is he a dick? Because, you can't have some stiff who's not capable of just relaxing and having a chat. But, but there have been good ones. For example, Jarlath was originally, his PR people pitched him to me and I had a little chat with him and he seemed like a sound bloke, and he was.
He was very good on it.
But yes, I don't think we've had people on before who I know. I was just looking at stuff that you commented on previously, just to remind Ian who you are and why we're chatting to you. There was one pod back in sort of February where you gave a really long and sort of considered comment. I think it was that X2.
It was in the X2 thing.
Yeah. So, but I'm just curious to know what you, as a, you're obviously an expert within the industry, but what do you derive from a pod like this? You know, what makes you listen to it?
Well, I mean, for me, I started listening in 2019, and before then, I didn't listen to any pods at all. And my boss...
Another beer, by the way.
No, in a minute.
You're right. Okay, we'll just say. Go ahead, sorry.
I'm just trying to make sure I'm coherent till the end.
No. You obviously don't understand the pod.
Vaguely coherent. My boss at the time asked me for some recommendations for a new guy starting. You know, what podcasts would you recommend, Mike? And I'm thinking, shit, I don't listen to any podcasts. I better start.
Right.
That's what I listen to. And I thought, I'm sure there's one on Telecoms.com. So I thought,
Cool.
I'll go and listen and see what that's like.
Yeah, because I've seen you
been doing
comment
it
on
for
stories as well. You obviously read the site from time to time
It's
as
like
well.
about 3 years worth of pods that I didn't listen to, but I
Right.
have listened to every single one since I
Have
started.
you? Cool.
I have, yeah.
Well, I don't know how old it is. I've forgotten how old it is. I think it started
We
before
started
me.
like, yeah, it was around the time. Yeah, it was around the time.
I think
I think it's 2016.
It preceded me.
I think it did precede. I think
Oh, yeah.
it preceded
Yeah,
the
right,
Like Reading
didn't it?
acquisition.
Yeah, you
Well, we were already
started-
doing it when you came on.
Yeah, for a few months, and then we stopped, and then we relaunched it with video in like
Right.
September 2016.
I seem to remember the first one I ever did had Tim Skinner on it.
Yeah, well, it was Tim's idea.
As yours, doing
It
your
was actually
role.
Tim who pushed it in the first place.
and
Yeah.
Jamie as well. And
Right.
and I found it quite awkward to do, but not because I've got anything wrong against those guys. It was
Yeah.
just, when you haven't done it before, it's a bit odd, isn't it?
So I did listen to some others once I
Right.
started, but I kept coming back to this one, thinking, well, this one's...
That's
this
what we
is
like to
just the
hear.
most- it's the most engaging, because the others were a bit dry and, well, they were shorter.
This one's
but
got longer.
This one...
It
yeah,
used to.
this
We
one-
used to. We used to try and cap it at an hour, and it's now it's gone to 2 hours before.
Sorry.
Yeah,
footsie
yeah.
with you.
I think I was having a run by the riverside when Pierre was chipping in. Wait, and I'm thinking, we haven't got to 2 hours, have we? And he said, we've gone over 2 hours.
And you'd run for 2 hours.
No,
God, I
didn't
feel
run for 2
inadequate.
hours.
That was
Lots of people listen
recently
to it when they're
I think.
running, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
I was probably just walking the dog and that.
Well, I listen to pods when I'm on the old cross trainer at home.
Yeah.
But yeah, walking the dog. I mean, that's what I really like. This isn't just about our pod. This is pods in general. And you've heard us bang on, like me and Pierre bang on about Joe Rogan and that sort of thing. That it's something about pods is sort of reinvigorated audio as a format.
Yeah.
So obviously, radio back in World War II and that sort of thing, people huddled around the radio, and then video came along. It's like that song, "Video Killed the Radio Star," isn't it?
Hans Zimmer.
There we go.
Well, it's
No,
he's
The
part of that
Buggles.
band. He was part
yeah,
of
the
that band.
Bubbles was it?
Buggles.
Buggles. That's it.
Hans Zimmer was
That's-
part of it.
Okay, all right. Yeah. I'm not arguing with you, mate.
A little trivia
I
here.
believe you.
But yeah, the thing about audio is if you're driving or if you're doing something else, you need your eyes to sort of get on with it, and audio is brilliant for that.
Yeah.
And you know what? Yeah, we haven't. It's not like we've given it that much thought, but we're lucky enough, and fair play to Informa. They've just sort of let us crack on with it. We're lucky enough to have just been able to let it evolve organically,
Yeah.
and we just sit here. It never used to be always drinking beer, and that's just become a thing now.
Well, I think that started during the pandemic because
Right.
we couldn't go out to the pub.
Yes,
That's when it came into its own for me. So you remember you interviewed on another pod about 6 months ago, I think it was.
Oh, was that with Liberty or Babel?
Babel, I think it was.
Right.
And you put something on LinkedIn about it, and
Right.
I commented back, and you read out my comment on the pod,
Yes. I
which
think we've
wasn't-
read out your comments once or twice.
which I
haven't we,
wasn't
on the-
expecting.
Right. Is that a bit weird when you listen to it and your name suddenly comes up?
Well, you said you kind of introduced it. You said, "Oh, someone's commented on the pod, and I want to read this out." And I'm thinking, that's not what I wrote, surely, and it was.
And now next week you can listen to yourself.
Yeah, I know that's going to be really surreal. but I mean, the point was that during the lockdown, when we didn't get to mix with our colleagues, that you needed things to keep you going, because looking at your own four walls day in day out, it was a bit
It was bizarre. Man.
soul-destroying.
It's bizarre. I mean, some people are still getting their head around that whole fucked up period of time.
Well, yeah.
But you guys kept it going remotely. And
Yeah,
you were
yeah, we did
cracking open the beers and having a good chinwag, and it kind of reminded me.
It was all right then. The remote ones were still tolerable. I mean, they're not as good as the
They were only for
face-to-face ones.
2.5 months, not even.
Yeah.
Yeah, there weren't that many of them, but they were. Yeah, I mean they ran okay.
I
For somebody who's
remember
in
coming
the car or
Yeah,
for a run
still
or
works.
walking the dog or whatever you're doing, it still works.
It was harder to sort of sync sometimes, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I found on the online ones, but, you know.
Yeah, because you don't have the non-verbal sort of cues
and also
all
when
that.
you do talk over each other, which frequently happens, it's just one of those things. It seems to
Yeah,
be
but
more difficult.
We spent all day doing that with conference calls at work. Every time we
Yeah.
had to have
Well,
a
that's
meeting,
true.
they were all remote and we all had those sync problems and talking over each other.
Yeah.
So it was just an extension of that. We were kind of used to it. But the thing was that it was reminiscent for me of I've had a day in London. We go out for a beer and we have a
Talk
chat.
shop.
Just talk shop. Yeah. And we never got to do that during the lockdown for months and months. So
That's good to know.
for me, just having that once a week was like, it kind of feels a bit more normal
Cool.
having this. And so it was a bit of a comfort through lockdown.
Oh, that's really good to hear.
Good, yeah.
And I couldn't do it any other way. I couldn't be stiffer and more formal.
We
It's
don't
just
want you to,
not-
Scott.
Well, it's just not my personality. But I also believe that it's not just my default. It's from listening to things like Joe Rogan. I listen to tons of pods. You know, you to a certain extent you buy into the people that you're listening to, and their personalities add a lot of value to it.
Yeah.
And, I think that's another reason why Rogan's quite successful, because he's very chilled. He's a comedian. He swears and talks shit. He sometimes has a joint on the pod or whatever, which we haven't done yet, and we're not about to in the Informer office. Don't worry. So I'm skinning up in front. But I think that's part of it. It's not just what they talk about. It's the fact that you sort of you sort of become mates with the person in a way.
It's funny. You just reminded me of something. On the pod last week, you said something about a story that Mary had written that had got your name on it by accident.
Yeah.
And now I reckon that about 9 times out of 10, I could spot your headlines.
Right.
I think that's a Scott. I'll read that. Yeah, it's a Scott one.
Why? What is it? They're a bit more
I don't know.
gobshitey. They're just a bit more
Probably,
Scott.
Or certainly, if I can't get it from the headline, if I didn't know who'd written it and I read it, I'd know which are yours.
Cool. That's nice. Well, we all aspire to have a voice when we write, don't we? So that's really nice to hear. You've definitely earned a return visit, but with that amount of saying nice things about me. In fact, I'm going to stop bringing it up because now it's going to just seem. You're
You're going to get tearful.
It's just going to be nauseating. Well, what else? What else am I good at? So no. Well,
I haven't read
but
your book yet. That might be shit.
well, opinion does seem divided on it. To be honest,
I am going to though. I'm going to give it a go. For $1.99, I can't refuse, can I?
you haven't read it either, have you, Pierre?
What?
He doesn't read books.
He
He
doesn't
watches
read books.
movies.
I don't read books. You need to narrate it for me.
I know. Well, do you know what? It's a weird chicken and egg thing because and it's not like I've got no sales, but no sales that are of an appreciable revenue. I'm not about to fucking retire on it. Let's put it that way. But yeah, it's one of those things like producing the audio version. I'm sure I could do it myself. I'm sure there's software and I've got the mic. The mic I bought to do the remote pods. Funnily enough, what's that called?
Is it called a Yeti?
That's the Yeti. Yeah, I was wondering if I was confusing
What is it
with
about
with the
Yetis?
cooler. So I could probably do that, but yeah, just because there hasn't been that great demand for it, I just can't be asked. But I think maybe I should just
Should
for
one
the
of
hell
those
of it.
when you go to a bookstore and you read a paragraph.
What's going to happen though when you do that is you're going to read a bit aloud and you're going to go, oh, really? Did I write it like that?
Yeah, well, I haven't.
That sometimes happens when you read stuff back aloud. You go, oh.
I actually got a review. I haven't got that many reviews, but I've got a few reviews on Amazon, and apart from the ones that are from my mates, some of my mates.
Shit, I know.
Yeah, don't worry. Now I just enjoy hassling you about
a year now, haven't I?
Stars.
But when you get one from a complete stranger, it's interesting because that's a sort of purer thing, and they're not normally completely complimentary. They sort of pick it to bits, and it's interesting having your sort of creative endeavour picked to bits by someone. And obviously you got to marshal your ego and not get butthurt about it and just go fair enough. And yeah, I thought it was a fair review. It still gave me 4 stars.
Yeah.
And the headline was a decent read. And I thought at the end of it, I was like, okay, I'll settle for a decent read.
Yeah.
It's better than shite, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
I did get 1 2-star review where he went, I started reading it and I couldn't finish it because it was rubbish. And I was like, okay, all right. Fair enough.
That was the whole review, was it?
More or less. Yeah, I'm sort of paraphrasing. But
didn't like it after the first paragraph.
no, I think he got about halfway in, which in some ways is worse.
Yeah.
It's like you're giving it a good stab and they just couldn't. Anyway, but this isn't about me and my faltering novel writing career. Let's move on to other stuff that's been going on in the world. I think Ian, I've only skimmed it, but I thought you wrote.
And you didn't read it.
Well, by
I
skimmed
read
is
your
like
whole book.
you read
And you
the
can
whole
read
book.
my 1,000-word parallel wireless article.
Well, I skimmed it.
That was quite long, actually. I read it this morning.
Right, there we go. Did you read it after I sent you the link that we might talk about it? Or,
Yeah.
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 Yeah, well, Ian's very good at doing those sort of longer,
It was
more in-depth things.
almost as long as the email I sent you in response to that pod
Right,
a
yeah.
couple of months ago. That you,
Almost as long as your comment on that X2 pod.
and I remember you saying on the next pod to Ian, "Have you read it? It's fucking long."
It's a thorough comment.
Yes,
I
that's,
thought fair enough.
yeah. Well, I mean, it
But
was.
you were trying to simplify something that's really complicated, and there's no two ways around it.
No, totally. I hope you didn't take my calling it fucking long as,
No,
as
no,
an
no.
outright criticism. It just is what it is. You know, I just call it like it is, don't I, mate?
I thought Ian's used to writing long stuff. He should be able to digest this easily.
Yeah, I read it. It's a good comment. Yeah.
But it's just fucking long.
It's quite long, yeah.
But anyway, you. So we. I don't know if we've spoken about it on the pod at all.
I don't
yet.
think we've talked about the parallel wireless.
No,
thing
we
anyway.
haven't done it because I haven't really covered it. Part of the reason I haven't covered it is because other people like you and was Keith's quite
Keith's
strong on
been
it.
all over it.
Yeah, I had a good chat with Keith last night actually.
Yes.
Do you know what? This is Keith from
Keith
Mobile
Dyer.
Network. Yeah,
Yeah.
we were actually blowing smoke up each other's arse because we're both 50. Most people both think we look younger than 50.
Really?
And we were just being nice to each other, saying, "Yeah, shut up,
Who are these people?
everyone."
Everyone except Pierre.
Everyone except Pierre, the smug 30-year-old or whatever you are in the corner there. How old are you?
22.
You've had a tough innings.
Yeah,
How old are you?
35.
35. Yeah. Well, there we are. Fuck off. Anyway, that's not what I wanted to talk about. Yeah. So Keith, you and Keith and others might have done a good job on it. Ray's probably done a good job on it. So I just sort of haven't done it. I felt like that sort of ship had already sailed. But it's a very relevant thing because Parallel, while it's not the biggest company in and of itself, it's very much in the middle of the Open RAN, O-RAN, whatever we call it, world.
Yeah.
And they've recently had to lay off a shitload of their staff.
Yeah, I mean, they're one of the companies that normally comes up in when you start talking about Open RAN and the sort of specialist vendors. I think they're one of the names that usually gets thrown out together with Altiostar, which is obviously now owned by Rakuten, and Mavenir is the other one.
Yeah.
And there's obviously lots of other companies involved in Open RAN, but from my perspective, most of the other companies are more established companies. I mean, you obviously need semiconductors, but it's not like it's given rise to new semiconductor companies. You obviously need some kind of cloud platform. You need all sorts
Whereas
of things.
Parallel, we associate almost entirely with Open RAN.
Yeah, I mean, there's the radio unit side of it as well. I guess with people like MTI and what's the one in Hong Kong? Comba, is it? But
anyway,
some of these radio unit vendors are more sort of, you see it, I suppose, as an opportunity to have a bigger presence than they've had in the past. But
so we had the story about their layoffs, and you wrote that up, and then I'll hand it over to you now. Then you had a follow-up exchange with their CEO. So why don't
yeah,
you
I mean,
talk us through that?
the layoffs happened because that's sort of where it comes from, and I don't think we've talked about it. But they're a software company. They do the kind of baseband software. Along with as do Altiostar, now Rakuten and Mavenir, and it's very hard to know how big they were in terms of employee numbers. But if you go on, and I never ever had, by the way, I wasn't one of those people who ever got told something by a sort of background source.
Right,
Whereas
deep throat.
Yeah, whereas obviously Keith at the Mobile Network did, and because I sort of trust him as a journalist, I think I've sort of based some of my coverage on that, linking back to his site, and he'd heard that it was about 80%, up to 80%, at a company that's probably about
hardcore.
1,000 people, I think. So if you're going down from 1,000 people to
Yeah,
200, I mean,
losing
the
8% of
big
your
question
people
is it going to be commercially
feels
viable
catastrophic.
anymore, really? How is it going to survive? And then I think that for it to have ended up in that situation, but by the way, I had some correspondence with Steve Papa, who's the CEO, which was the reason I kind of wrote the story. And he disputes the 80% figure,
Right.
but he just wouldn't give
you an
one.
accurate one.
I mean, some
Did
other people have
you
put
go
it,
79, 78, 77?
Well, I did ask him to. He's perfectly within his rights not to want to speak to me or give me a figure. And I did ask him if he wanted to have a phone interview, because I think the interesting thing is no one's really heard his sort of side of it. He doesn't seem to have got on the phone with anybody and gone, well, this is what happened. And then you can actually put questions to him. He's put a blog up on LinkedIn, but it's a little bit sort of, it's a marathon, not a sprint sort of type of blog, one of those sorts of things.
Okay.
It doesn't really tell you what went wrong. And I think
it's a funny old game.
There's been a lot of speculation. The speculation will continue. It's not like I had sort of firm answers in the thing I wrote about how you end up in a situation where a few months ago they were talking about doubling the size of the workforce. There were statements going out from senior sort of marketing people there about, we want to double the size of the workforce, we were moving into new premises, and then sort of 6, 7, 8 months later, whatever it is, trying to think how old those stories are, but they're not that old. It's laid off up to 80%.
And
say between 50 and 80%.
Did this Steve Papa, is that his name?
Yeah.
Did he concede that there had been significant layoffs?
Yes, but
but just didn't put a number on it.
Yeah. But so I think people are trying to understand sort of what went wrong, and and then you've had analysts who cover Open RAN, the ones that I know, which includes our own sort of in-house people, by the way, Omdia, as well as Deloro. They've not altered their Open RAN forecasts, by the way. I haven't heard anybody say...
really cold.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't heard anybody say that there's a bigger problem with Open RAN, and this is a sign of that, and that we're going to see more of this sort of thing going on.
But it's a reasonable thing to...
It is.
To inquire about.
It is, yeah.
I mean, if Open RAN was going so great, why is Parallel having a nightmare?
Yeah, and one thing he did concede, which I'd covered in my piece on it, that I don't think a lot of other people had sort of mentioned, was, which I actually got from speaking to Gabriel Brown, who's another analyst at Heavy Reading, is that one of the reasons that things have been quite difficult for Parallel Wireless is all their work was in developing markets like Latin America, you mentioned earlier, and Africa. And those have become a real focus for Huawei in the last sort of year or two, because obviously Huawei is facing restrictions in the West. It's lost a lot of business in countries like this one, and therefore they've had to sort of double down on other regions and sort of put more effort into winning business and defending contracts there. And therefore competition from Huawei has just become a lot more intense for Parallel Wireless, basically.
I see.
And Steve Papa did concede that was an issue, but he said it wasn't the main issue.
Right.
And his thing seems to be that that there has been sort of O-RAN development has sort of slowed down a bit. And one of the things he blames for that is kind of US policy.
And that was your headline?
Yeah.
Your headline was Parallel Papa.
That was the most sort of news.
US policy is threatening Open RAN. Do you know, I'm going to have to butt in.
Yeah, go for it.
Beer's just caught up with me. I'm going to have to go and have a visit.
You're doing it?
Yeah, I've got to.
Oh, dearie
so
me.
I have to
That's
sneak
because
past
you've had
you,
about 5 of them.
Yeah, I didn't even have any on the train on the way down, which I normally do, because I was...
Yeah. Well, I'll just carry on talking while you sprint.
Mike's read your piece on my record.
Yeah, well, Mike can come in, but they basically one of the things he was saying is that they've suffered because of US policy, and it's obviously not intentional, but he says the sort of knock-on effects of some of the things the US has done has made it more difficult for Open RAN in terms of trying to restrict the Chinese, for instance, and trying to make it hard for radio kit makers in China. But the slight oddity about that is, this is what I don't quite get about the logic, is that Open RAN isn't just about China. I mean, was it Steve Papa's, is it his kind of assertion that they do the software and they're going to be very heavily reliant on a Chinese, Open RAN sort of radio supply chain? Because if that's the case, I don't think that's really what US policymakers were intending when they started talking so, optimistically about this technology a couple of years ago. And the other thing he's a bit upset about is the funding. He just doesn't seem to think there's been enough sort of funding coming through, and part of it's related to this rip and replace program they've got going on in, rural parts of the US where they previously used ZTE or Huawei, and they've now been told they have to take it out. But federal funds that were promised have not been enough to do the job, if you like, and it's left some of these companies in an awkward position. But again, I don't really see why that's been bad for him, because if you look at the contracts that have gone for this rip and replacement, all of them, apart from one, as far as I'm aware, have gone to Ericsson and Nokia anyway. So, So for me, the sort of reasons he gives, they're kind of, I don't know, they're a little bit, yeah.
He could make a good politician, couldn't he? Skirting around the issues.
I mean, I don't know. You're in this area though as well, Mark. I mean, I don't know if you, because he was also saying he wasn't just his other reason, his economic problems. Obviously, at the moment, none of us are in a good situation in terms of inflation, the supply chain issues. It's harder to get hold of components. Obviously, not obviously, but I would think for smaller companies, it's a bigger challenge than it is for some of the big kit vendors who've, been able to sort of diversify their supply chains perhaps a bit more easily. It sounds like he was perhaps quite dependent on this Chinese market that he was, going on about, this Chinese radio market. So, maybe that is a factor that you have to consider. But
there's definitely there are big issues in the supply chain.
Yeah,
I mean, we're seeing that like everyone else, but
is that mainly chip-based issues, or is it everything?
I guess that's what's at the root of it. But yeah, I mean, in terms of trying to get equipment that you got contractually on a 12-week lead time might take much longer.
Yeah, we spoke on a pod recently about when I was chatting to a car salesman. It's like brand new Ford Focus take you about a year to get hold of one. Ford Focus is one of the most commoditized, Model T type of cars, you'd think.
Yeah,
but even them, because they all need these chips.
Yeah.
By the way, thanks for bearing with me. Now I can drink loads more.
Well, you freed yourself up.
Supplier told us the other day, actually, that if you haven't put your order in for chips, expect to wait 12 months. Yeah, if you order anything now, it'll be 12 months before you get it.
And I think one of the issues with obviously China is, which Nokia was going on about this week as well, is just lockdowns, factory lockdowns, meaning that things just weren't getting made, basically. And that's still, I don't know what's going on actually, but I haven't heard much about the whole sort of Chinese lockdown situation recently, but they obviously do react to any signs of a virus outbreak, it seems, just by almost sealing people into their homes and and closing everything immediately as soon as there's like one case. It's that extreme. So
did you ever see that bit of footage of like people in tower blocks in China just sort of wailing and pleading to be let out?
No, I haven't.
It was really
quite
fucking
sinister.
apocalyptic.
Yeah.
Well, and I don't know. We were sort of alluding to the lockdown earlier when we were talking, when Mike was kind enough to say that our pod was a source of relief.
Yeah.
But there's so many things to do with the lockdown that are still going to filter through the global economy for probably years, if not decades, to come. Because it's like it's just a massive inflection point. Obviously, right now we've got the inflation, which we banged on about a lot last week, and that's clearly a direct consequence of the amount of basically fiscal stimulus that had to come in to compensate everyone for being locked in their houses.
Yeah.
And this supply chain thing seems to be definitely a factor, and it's exacerbated. It's almost a perfect storm because we had the sort of Trump policies of hassling the Chinese and trying to prevent them getting access to things. But however you feel about the Chinese geopolitically, they are still the factory of the world.
Yeah.
You can't just decouple from the factory of the world overnight. So there's so many weird things going on. One thing. Sorry if you were if you're not ready for me to go off on a tangent and tell me. Go on.
I mean, maybe just going back to the other thing, the other reasons why I think they might have struggled. One thing I did hear on background from a source who's pretty well connected, but obviously can't mention who it is.
Deep throat.
Was that they sort of focused very heavily on 2G and 3G. Which is obviously a very good way for them to get into these emerging market.
Oh, right, you put that in your story, didn't you?
Yeah, but they sort of deprioritised, neglected to spend a lot of time looking at 5G. Again, Steve Papper sort of denies that, but it's quite interesting to see that the deals that, and he also said, although he didn't really want to comment on that, he didn't really want to get into that, he did say there aren't a lot of 5G greenfield networks being built, are there? Which is a fair point. There aren't. But if you look at the ones that are taking shape, he's not, they don't show up anywhere, basically, parallel wireless. And they don't show up in the swap outs that have gone to Open RAN players either. So Dish, for instance, is using Mavenir Altiostar, but has also brought Samsung in, I think, recently. Vodafone, which is doing its 2,500 site swap out in the West, ran trials with Parallel Wireless in Ireland and Mavenir in the UK, but eventually went with Samsung. In Japan, unsurprisingly, given that they own Altiostar, they're using Altiostar, and then partly because of that relationship and because it's now part of this Rakuten Symphony bigger thing, that they seem to be sort of in the hot seat for things like what 1&1 in Germany, and they seem to be making some inroads with Telefonica as well. Parallel Wireless just didn't really seem to have any of that. It was just this emerging market stuff.
So how sympathetic are you to your own headline where you quote him saying that US policy... I'm sorry if you covered this while I was off having a visit. Yeah. But you said US policy is throttling Open
questionable.
RAN. You think him saying that... Do you agree that US policy is throttling Open RAN or not?
I'm not sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And it could just be an excuse.
He might have a point. His point really is that I think the funding one, I don't really buy into it that much. This business about rural funding in the US, that there hasn't been the support that's needed. I was just saying that the jobs that have been awarded have all pretty much gone to Ericsson and Nokia anyway on that sort of thing, and which I think just gets into this whole. Open RAN is good, but it's going to take time, and we have to sort of be patient. And especially if you're a small company at the moment and you're looking at all the other challenges that go with Open RAN, I think you're more likely as one of those players to go with a company that pre-integrates and just sells you something.
Well, and I can imagine that a company like Parallel, when they're getting all these signals from things like the US government, we've been writing for at least a couple of years about how the US government wants to chuck money at Open RAN because it considers it a strategic thing as part of the getting rid of Chinese vendors from their networks and diversifying the supply chain or whatever. Yeah. Because obviously... But
that's the old thing about Steve's remarks, because he was sort of saying, this is his other point, why he thinks US policies hurt Open RAN, because he was saying a lot of these restrictions against the Chinese have made it hard to get sort of radios from China. It seems to be what he's saying.
Oh, I see.
It's like he said, I can't remember how he phrased it, and I've probably quoted him on it in the story, I think, the critical thing that he said, but it's sort of, we've had to redo the supply chain at a time when it's the worst supply chain crisis I can remember, kind of thing. Because of this anti-Huawei thing, which has meant it's very hard to sort of do things with, seem to be implying it's very hard to do things with Chinese radio developers.
I found the quote I think you're referring to. You say the entire investment in building an ORAN end-to-end supply chain had to be repeated in the worst supply chain crisis of our generation. Is that what you're referring to? Yeah. But
there's a bit before that as well, I think, where it's not only partly quoting him, but I'm sort of paraphrasing him.
Right. Talk about material delays and shit like that.
But the odd thing is that, this is the weird thing about US policy, not really, I don't think, getting what Open RAN is sometimes. And maybe there's a big disconnect there between... You've got these weird groups having like the Open RAN Policy Coalition that you notice doesn't have any Chinese members at all, and is very, very clearly very anti-Chinese in its aims, and it's all about if we sort of clamp down on Huawei, they seem to think that money will flow towards money will flow. Well, he's not Open RAN at all, but money will flow towards Open RAN. But then the actual Specs Group, the ORAN Alliance, is full of Chinese companies because it came into being. It was a merger of two other groups. It was I think CRAN Forum maybe or something, and the XRAN Forum and the CRAN Alliance. The CRAN Alliance is Chinese. It was led by China Mobile. So, and it's got more Chinese companies in it than.
It's not China.
No, centralized RAN, isn't it? Or Cloud RAN, one or the other.
But say that's not a good bit of branding. Just call it Chinese.
But there's more Chinese companies in the ORAN Alliance than there are from any other nation apart from I think the US. There's about 40 odd companies in it, and I mean maybe this is one of the things Steve was getting at, because there was concern. I know the people who say, this company should be on the entity list and we shouldn't really be doing anything with them because they're linked to the People's Republic, and some of the members of the ORAN Alliance I think had caused a bit of upset among other alliance members. If you remember, Nokia paused development work within the ORAN Alliance for a few weeks
because they were worried that they were going to get on the wrong side.
They were worried about breaching US sanctions basically by collaborating with Chinese companies in this group essentially. And then it somehow got resolved. I can't exactly remember how, but it got resolved.
They just got told which boxes to tick.
But even now, I think one of the companies has sort of disappeared from the ORAN alliance. One of those players that the US was concerned about. It's not a member anymore. So,
Mike, you sounded like you were going to say something a minute ago, because I don't want to go off.
I was,
tangent.
but then Ian said it. So.
Oh, really? What was the thing he said?
Oh, it was about the Nokia.
Oh, right,
backing off from ORAN
Yeah.
for a few weeks.
So more generally, because I've got a couple of tangents, not necessarily directly related to Ian's story, but to do with just sort of state intervention in the telecom sector, especially in the US. But in the context of this story, and I suppose the broader issue, not so much about Parallel, but the state of play of Open RAN right now, and obviously we touched on it earlier about your core business, you overlap with that. Again, Ian's headline was quoting this guy saying that US policy is throttling Open RAN. How, I suppose, Mike, what I'm curious to know your view on is how big a role government's public sector, public money plays in that, and whether you think that's good, whether you think they could do more. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think from our point of view, we're in terms of, if you like, government money, we want to leverage what local councils, authorities are going to potentially invest in improving the infrastructure in their jurisdictions. And to that extent, it then should be, as you like to say, a laissez-faire environment. See who wins.
TM.
We'll go in and we'll compete with others.
Scott Libertarian TM. Yeah.
And play within the rules, and if public money features as part of that, then we're out to provide benefit to the local community through the deployments that we make, and then pull revenue in from selling that to operators, and obviously providing. We don't provide service necessarily to the local authority for free, but as part of that arrangement, we might get access to assets that would otherwise be challenging.
What
to
you mean, like
acquire.
sites and stuff? Yeah. Well, that's always to sort of take it a step back and more into the sort of Scott Cheney Libertarian TM view. That's always the challenge of where public and private intersects, because they obviously should intersect. You can get, like in the UK, you can get into all kinds of pseudo-religious debates about private sector involvement in the NHS, for example. But of course, the NHS has always had to buy its equipment and its drugs and its stuff from the private sector. There's no clear distinction where public stops and private starts and vice versa. But, back to Ian's story and back to other tangents I might go off on in a sec. The flip side of that is when public sector does get involved, and let's say, this kind of reminds me a little bit, this isn't directly relevant, but it's just what springs to mind. About 20 years ago, or something like that, 10 or 20 years ago, I think a Labour government started offering people incentives to put solar panels on their roofs. And so lots of people did it, and they said, we'll pay you, we'll subsidise the panels, and then we'll also buy the surplus electricity off you and just plug it into National Grid or whatever it is you do.
Yeah.
And then there came a time where Gordon Brown went, no, actually, we're not doing that anymore. And then a bunch of people who'd made these investments were suddenly left high and dry. And the only reason I bring that up is, maybe that can happen. If you've got someone like the US government banging on about, we're going to throw money at anyone who gets involved with Open RAN, and then suddenly you get a time where that money dries up. That's a really precarious business model, is to rely too heavily on sort of public subsidy and public sector involvement. Does that make any sense at all, what I just said?
Yeah, well, I think
I've had a few beers by this stage.
I think governments and public bodies, they are out to find ways to oil the wheels to make other people invest, so they don't have
Right.
to. Right. So
Incentivise and
and we've seen public investment in a lot of what you might private investment in a lot of what you might consider public infrastructure in the UK, and elsewhere. But I think what we're trying to do is we are prepared to invest because we've got insights into where the demand is. Prove our model in a pilot or trial with the local authority and other players in the vicinity, but then invest in order to realise our own business case that we've proven through the modelling, and we're just looking for avenues to oil the wheels to make the infrastructure happen.
Makes sense. It makes sense, and good public-private partnerships. I should definitely get that bit in earlier on in the pod. It should be the best of both worlds, but my fear is sometimes they can be the worst. Anyway, sorry, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say on the sort of public sector involvement in Open RAN. I often get made out to be an Open RAN sort of cynic. Which I
a journalist, cynical. What next?
Well, sceptical you should be, not cynical. But,
okay, fair enough.
But I don't think I am. I mean, I actually agree with a lot of the analyst forecasts that say Open RAN will account for 15% by the mid-20s, and then it goes up. I just think the issue for me is who the winners are. And I think this is one of the problems with the public sector involvement is that it's been pushed as this attempt is a very sort of geopolitical thing. It never started out like that, by the way, when the two groups came together in 2018. Sort of before Trump had started making a lot of noise about Huawei, it was just a technical thing. It was like, this is a good way to build networks.
And then it became this national strategic
And then it's become this sort of nationalistic, we need to have our own players and we need to have alternatives. And the story starts with talking about Biden, actually, because he went over to Saudi Arabia and he did this thing about... this really weird comment, which almost, for anybody reading it who doesn't know what Open RAN is, and it's a pretty arcane thing anyway, if you're not in telecom, just presents it as though it's almost a company or a US thing. And then there's this point, and it'll win out over all the other options, including China. And it's like
Open RAN versus
so
China,
because
it's so simplistic,
Chinese anyway. And this is the interesting thing about Steve Papper's comments about China, is that Steve Papper seems to see it more in a sort of global context, that it's we need suppliers in these markets, we need suppliers in those markets, whereas the US and people like Biden, the policymakers, seem to think they could just get together a kind of alternative to Ericsson based on Open RAN, which is not what Open RAN's really about.
And it's really funny because politically, Trump's big thing was sort of economic nationalism. Yeah, so make America great again, bring jobs back to the US, open up fucking coal mines, whatever it is he wanted to do. And this economic nationalism is definitely carried over. Yeah. There's a hell of a lot of momentum from the Trump to the Biden, supposedly adversarial, supposedly polar opposites. It's been quite consistent.
There's a lot of concern in Europe, I know, about, among the operators in Europe, about the lack of sort of local players that would sort of fill their Open RAN needs. And we were at this Vodafone dinner, Scott, you remember, with Diego Tenorio, chatting to him afterwards, and that's clearly something that bothers him a lot, that we don't sort of have local companies, many anyway, not many. But I actually don't think the US has done particularly well out of Open RAN so far, or certainly not. If you look at those companies we're talking about, the ones that get thrown up, and they're always the ones that get cited in any sort of general article. Well, Parallel Wireless now looks in big trouble if it's laid off 80% of stuff. I don't know what's going to happen to it, but that's not healthy. One of them is under Japanese control, basically. So, okay, it's still based in the US, but it's owned by a Japanese company. It's basically part of Rakuten. I don't even think they use the Altiostar brand anymore. Okay. And Mavenir, to my knowledge, hasn't really done a lot apart from this contract with Dish. Oh. And Dish recently.
John Baker's going to be slagging you off.
This is a really interesting thing about Dish is they went out, they got Mavenir, they got Altiostar, and then a few months later they went, we'll have Samsung as well. And it's like, do you really need three sort of software companies on that side? I'm very curious about, and Mike Dana knows them much better than I do, he writes about them all the time, but you sense that Dish, it has all these vendors in its list, but who's it actually going to use? I think a lot of it's about sort of, having choices and having options and testing them against each other, but then when it actually comes to doing something and using it, they're probably only going to go with one. And to me, the big winners so far, the guys who really seem to have advanced with Open RAN are actually mainly sort of Asian players. You've got Samsung, obviously. NEC seems to have done very well out of it.
Yep.
You know, Rakuten's emerged as this almost. I know it doesn't make hardware, but it's almost become a sort of integrated software.
There's a story we put
company.
up today where they're opening up a big sort of branch of Symphony in India.
Yeah,
You
I did see that.
Like
I think
reading covered that as well.
Did it for us, yeah. So it's just sort of, it's that sort of whack-a-mole, you know, the unintended consequences.
Well, and this is the thing. This is this is my bugbear about sort of top-down tinkering, which is typically how I would characterise government involvement in markets.
Yeah.
They're top down. They pick winners. They come up with a strategic objective, and they go, right, we've got to get this. But as you say, there's whack-a-mole. There's law of unintended consequences. There's chaos theory. There's just the lack of humility to understand that they can't control as much as they would like.
Yeah, but I'm not anti-Open RAN because some people have said I'm anti-Open RAN. And I actually think networks will increasingly get built that way. I do think they will, and I think certainly the 6G will probably be. Maybe that's the point when, you know, they actually get baked into the 3GPP standards.
But will it
people
be
have figured out those big challenges like systems integration and some other things?
But will it be because governments have made it happen, or should they just get the fuck out of the way? That's one of the questions, isn't it? You know, are they doing more harm than good? And that's an eternal question.
And what they don't know is what the lands. This is where I'm dubious. Is what the landscape, what the competitive landscape is going to look like. You know, it'll be Open RAN on paper. And it'll have those specifications and it'll have the ability to swap things out perhaps. But in terms of this, we're going to have this market where instead of it just being dominated by 3 big kit vendors, it's going to be, you know, lots and lots of specialists. I don't really buy that at all.
Oh, dear I know. It's all right, we won't comment. I just saw someone ringing in and it made me laugh.
I think some of the negative press that Open RAN gets is because it's always been compared against the big vendors in the 5G macro rollout phase, which we are heavily into right now. You know, that's where the money is, and that's why the focus is there, because that's where the dollars are being spent today. And it often gets knocked back because, you know, operators are being forced to swap out Chinese vendors, and they've got to make a decision. They've got to do it now. They've got to invest a lot of money, and they don't feel that they want to take that level of risk with cutting edge technology.
Yeah.
But you know, there's plenty more to do after the macro rollout in 5G. Just look at indoor, for example. Indoor is something that's been neglected throughout the generations, and it wasn't an issue when we had indoor.
As we can see in this room, where we can't get 4G signal.
Oh,
or 5G signal.
I thought you were talking about the forest moon in Return of the Jedi.
No.
Okay, all right, let's go there then.
Yeah. But you know, indoor coverage is something that's become increasingly difficult through the generations, partly because frequencies are increasing and so the penetration is worse, but also because building materials are changing.
Yeah.
And it's going to get to the point where you're forced. You know, 80% of demand comes from indoors, and yet 95% of coverage and capacity deployment happens outside. So you're always relying on an outside in.
Totally. Often, you might have heard on pods in the past, we've sort of talked about Wi-Fi, and like everyone's banging on about this, that, and the other to do with 5G. But people probably spend 90% of their time with their wireless connectivity being Wi-Fi.
I remember the first time I ever heard about small cells. We were at the Savoy with Ray, and then I'd look at my phone, I was like, look at that, no signal, what the hell? And Ray's like, we need more small cells. I said, what? What is that?
Right.
I had no idea.
That thing.
So there's plenty more to do beyond the macro layer.
So I've got a couple of things. You just reminded me a couple of things, and then I'm going to move on to the last item. Just a couple of tangents that I've been holding off on because I didn't want to interrupt the flow. But you were talking about the sort of forced swap out in the States. There's one story we wrote this week. I haven't got it up, but I can just remember it, where apparently. So they've got these smaller operators or carriers, as they call them in the States, that have still got a bunch of Huawei or ZTE kit in, and they're going, you've got to get rid of it. And they've had a whip round and come up with like a couple of billion to compensate them, and they've come back and gone, nah, man, that's about 40% of what we were
talking about that while you were taking your toilet break.
While I was off. Oh, okay, all right. Well, I won't dwell on it. But that's another. Yeah, okay, I won't dwell on it. But that's an example of state involvement not functioning optimally in that particular case.
Well, I think the public sector always underestimates what things cost, doesn't it?
Yeah, and then on the flip side, the carriers are probably trying to get as much wedge out of the taxpayers they can.
You were kind of implying earlier, Ian, that this money was kind of promised and then not forthcoming. So,
well, I think the amount promised has been released, but I think they have said it's going to cost more than
right.
Yeah,
it's about
there was an original. There's a $2 billion.
Yeah, and now they want $5 billion.
Support, but it's but the thing is, the FCC agrees. It agrees that the whole job's going to cost about $5 billion, but it's like the money's not there.
So what happens if they don't do it?
Well, I don't know.
What are the
That's a big question.
Exactly. That's the really good point. I mean, without getting into the fact that they can easily find another $3 billion, they're pulling money out their arse left, right, and centre these days. They can find like $100 billion to chuck at Ukraine.
We can find $100 billion to spend on a train line. So
well, quite. So, but yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, it's a bit of a standoff, isn't it? And then the other thing that I wanted to quickly mention, just because we were chatting about it before we started recording, is a story I wrote this morning, where the headline was, the US seems to be failing in its bid to cripple Chinese high-tech capability. And this is to do with the sort of Trump-driven entity list and embargoes.
This relates to what Steve was saying, I think, this sort of thing.
Right,
yeah.
so I'll quickly say this and then you can tell me where the jigsaw pieces fit in with each other. Cut long story short, the biggest so a fab is a factory that makes semiconductors. The biggest, most advanced fab in the world is TSMC in Taiwan. Next biggest and most advanced is Samsung, and then Intel's right up there. And then China's got one called SMIC. And they're considered to be a bit behind. Last time we checked in with them, they were operating on something like a 14 nanometer process, whereas like Samsung recently announced they're doing 3 nanometers. Now, I'm not going to get into the weeds of what these numbers mean.
Have you ever had anything out? Do you call it SMIC, by the way, or do you say SMIC?
I tend to say SMIC, but SMIC, I quite like SMIC.
Anything out of them? Because I've tried getting in touch with them, and they just
no. I'm not as proactive as you. I'm not as proactive as you. I just write about people and wait for them to moan. But no, I haven't.
You get in touch.
Yeah, you get in touch with me.
The other one's YMTC that I've tried contacting, and they don't.
Which just makes me want to do that dance.
Yeah,
me too.
Anyway, which is the only time I want to do that dance. So that says something. I've never actually done the YMCA dance.
Really?
Well, I'm proud to say.
Have you done the Macarena though?
No. I'm not known for my dancing. Full stop. But
I've seen you dance though.
Have you?
When you turned 50.
Oh yeah. Well, I have to be that pissed before I start dancing, and that's not really. That's the broadest definition of dancing. It's just sort of getting in people's way,
the dance floor,
basically. Anyway, so SMIC or SMIC has apparently started producing chips on the 7 nanometer process, which you could just think numerically, given that the nanometers refer to how small the individual component parts of a silicon chip are, and so smaller is better. So if they've gone from 14 last time we checked into 7, they're obviously able to do things at half the size, which basically means you can fit twice as much shit into the same space.
Yeah,
that's the technical word. I'm sure you agree, Mike.
Yeah.
That's what you wrote in your white paper about it. But they're not supposed to be able to do that because America's been doing this thing. They put them on the entity list, which means they can't get hold of a lot of the chip making kit, most of which is made by American companies, to the best of my knowledge, or at least a lot of which. I know you're going to mention a Dutch one in a sec, but the angle I took on it, and bear in mind, I was a bit hungover this morning. I only had about an hour to write it, so it wasn't the most fucking thorough thing I've ever written. Was that all these American attempts to stymie Chinese technological process by putting these trade embargoes on them, this seems to be evidence that they're not working. So that sort of feeds into this general top-down government intervention. Doesn't ever seem to quite go according to plan. But yeah, Ian, we were talking just before about another company that's critical to the more advanced chip manufacturing processes, which is Dutch. So just remind us of that.
Yeah.
We'll quickly do that, and then we'll move on to the last thing.
But they're a company called ASML. So they make lithography equipment. So it's basically it kind of etches the circuits into the silicon wafers.
Super precise. Sort of.
Yeah. And there's only, to my knowledge, there's only 3 companies that really do it, or 3 sort of leading companies that do lithography: ASML, Canon, and Nikon.
Right.
So 2 are Japanese and 1's Dutch. But ASML has a monopoly in the market for something called EUV, which is extreme ultraviolet lithography, which they say you need anyway for the really sort of
5 nanometer, 3 nanometer.
Yeah. and they can't ship to China. Basically, they can ship DUV, which is deep ultraviolet.
And why can't they ship to China?
Because there's this thing called the Wassenaar Agreement, which is it's an agreement between 42 countries, and they're all sort of Western type democracies,
US allied, Western European,
to restrict the flow of they call it dual use technology. You might have heard that expression before. So it's technology that has a civilian and military use potentially,
right?
And they can't. And EUV falls under the category of dual use, basically. And the agreement is not to ship to countries that are sort of blacklisted, I guess. So,
so the underlying thing is, like, there was a little quote when SMIC was added to the entity list at the end of 2020. There was a quote from the US government announcement. They said,
well, the entity list would stop things like Applied Materials and Lam Research, which I don't think they do lithography. I don't know. They do equipment for.
But the only reason I mention it is this quote. They said that. They said the technologies needed for semiconductor manufacturing processes of 10 nanometers and below will be, quote, subject to a presumption of denial to prevent such key enabling technology from supporting China's military modernization efforts. So there's an explicit statement that what they're really trying to do, they're not accusing of industrial espionage, they're not accusing them of spying through Huawei kit and US networks. They're basically saying, we don't want your military to get better.
And the weird thing is that if you look at sales at Lam Research and Applied Materials, and there's another one called KL something. What is it? Anyway, it's not KLM, obviously. But but if you look at their sales, China's been a massive growth market for all three of them over the last few years. So they can't ship to SMIC, but they ship to like YMTC, which is another kind of big Chinese foundry that does memory chips. Controversially, apparently has a deal with Apple to sell memory chips to them. Light Reading was the first organisation to break that story, by the way.
Fair play.
Yeah.
Was that you?
Yeah. It was me, but I don't blow my own trumpet. I just say it's Light Reading. But
no. Well, I'm encouraging you to blow your own trumpet.
You're making it blush now.
and they're thought to be sort of one of Applied Materials' big customers. So
it's not working. This is the central narrative I'm trying to make. Is it's not working. These governments think they can control everything, and they just fucking
get missed. And I think even if there aren't loopholes and things that get missed, what eventually happens is the market finds a solution. That they find some kind of workaround. I mean, what it might just do is, and one thing it has done is accelerate China's push to become self-reliant and develop its own.
So back to this SMIC thing.
Yeah, exactly.
They seem to be tapping along quite nicely.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know how easy it is to do 7 nanometer chips
without
the
EUV
equipment, that I'm not sort of disputing the Tech Insights report. If they say they've taken it to pieces and looked at it, then it's really interesting. But the point is, China is trying to have the kind of capabilities in chips that the US has, and I think everybody agrees at the moment.
Sorry, can I butt in? You say the US has, but that's actually not the case. Apparently, there are no US or European fabs that are even doing 7 fucking nanometers at the moment. It's just Samsung and TSMC.
Yeah, and on the foundry level, I know.
So so on that level, China's actually ahead of the US and Western Europe, which is interesting in a geopolitical way.
If that 7 nanometer thing's right.
Well, yeah.
But I mean,
taking that at face value.
Yeah, all right. The two leading foundries, as you said, are TSMC in Taiwan and Samsung in Korea. But they don't have the the guys that use those people as contract makers. They don't have the Xilinxes, Apple as well. Now as a chip company, the Qualcomms, the Marvells, the Nvidias. They don't have those. So it's not just there's all sorts of areas where they're sort of lacking that expertise, and one of them is this lithography thing, this EUV. I suspect is something that China's trying to do. I mean, one thing that ASML actually interestingly points out in its SEC filings is that it's always worried about sort of intellectual property infringement in China, or not always worried about it, but there have been concerns about.
Yes,
which is a long-running thing with China. I know this sort of IP theft sort of issue, but
in fact, I think in the story that I covered for this, the source, which as you say was from a company called Tech Insights, was saying that their process looks pretty fucking similar to the TSMC 7-nanometer process.
Right. Okay.
So that sort of feeds that industrial espionage narrative.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because, you know, the TSMC being obviously Taiwan and so close to China, and you kind of feel that they would try to, that would be an obvious place for China to try and have sort of spies, you know, within TSMC who are,
you'd think,
feeding information back.
Well, you can just do it the old-fashioned way and buy stuff and reverse engineer it.
Yeah. I mean, we know Huawei's done that in the past. You know, they've reverse engineered things, and we know they've spied on other companies. We know, you know, that's a story. That,
yeah, it's like, did we?
Do we know this bloke?
2003-4 Ray's story of the trade. You've seen it. The Wall Street Journal picked it up.
Yeah, was it that T-Mobile thing?
Yeah. So they've, you know, those things are known.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised if surprised if China wasn't trying to sort of infiltrate TSMC and get access to. So
yes.
By the way, I'm not saying that any of this is beyond the US either. I'm not,
totally. Well, that's the other thing to bear in mind when we paint places like China or wherever as these sort of baddies.
Yeah.
It's not to say that we're fucking whiter than white. Everyone's up. Everyone's up to no good.
They went wiretapping Angela Merkel's phone, didn't they, a few years ago and stuff? So you know, they can get up to all sorts of weird stuff.
Yeah,
well,
I'm just thinking. I was going to advance it to a third thing, but we must be coming up for 2 hours by now.
We don't have to talk about Nokia's results.
No.
I mean,
should we just sort of wrap it up at that stage?
We could talk about it for 4 minutes. Yeah.
Let's try. What we got.
We're 4 minutes short of 2 hours.
But Mike's got a bit of. Have you got trivia about Nokia that you said you wanted?
Yeah, let's wrap it up with that, and wrap it up with Mike anyways. He's our special guest. What was this?
That was the other thing that was a saving grace during lockdown. So trying to keep morale up. Our VP of business development at the time ran this series of coffee calls twice a day. I think they were, to start with, just to keep people talking, because we obviously weren't allowed to meet. And during the course
you didn't
of
just
these
turn into
coffee
a brain
calls,
in a jar.
I just sort of threw in a couple of trivia questions to see if anybody knew them.
Okay.
And they kind of, they landed well, so people kind of enjoyed them. The next time they said, got any other trivia for us, Mike?
So you had to start putting some work into it.
Once I got to about 15, I thought, shit, I need to do some homework now.
Yeah.
I haven't got any more. So I'd spend like hours in the evening researching on the web, trying to find questions. And I think I'm up to 150 now.
Wow.
Which I thought.
And you've kept a record of them all. You've got them.
Yeah, I've got them all. Yeah, some of them have got pictures and things, and I'm thinking about maybe I might actually make it into a book at some point.
Yeah.
But my Nokia one was one of the early ones. So
are you going to ask us it?
Yeah.
Go on then.
What was Nokia's first product?
Oh, I might know this.
Oh, I think it was.
Go on, you go first then.
It was rubber. It was tyres or something like that, wasn't it?
Was it toilet roll?
Yeah, close. So tyres do come into it.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, it was a paper mill was what they set up. So paper was their first product.
Was rubber a thing in their history? Am I just barking up the wrong tree there?
There was a rubber company that they merged with, and then they also merged with a cable manufacturer, which is how the telecoms bit started. But I think that was the third.
Have you just?
It was founded as a pulp mill, and had long been associated with rubber and cables.
Yeah.
So
rubber. So
we've all got.
So three companies.
We're all a bit right.
Three. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, three companies merged to form Nokia. But the oldest, and the original one called Nokia because it was.
I think you're thinking toilet paper because of
near
the
Nokia.
Headquarters in Espoo.
Place.
Well, no, some of the products that are made by the pulp mill were toilet paper. You can see some Nokia toilet roll. Nokia.
That's why they are in Espoo.
Hey!
I didn't hear that.
I had to go again twice.
Stealing my joke.
I didn't hear it the first time either.
So when I was researching this, just to make sure that I got all the facts right, I found a picture, and you're right. There were some Nokia toilet
rolls.
Yeah. So I
think I might have used one in a story.
My quip on the coffee call was that once it was the done thing to flush your Nokia down the toilet.
There we go.
And Espoo.
Which drugs dealers still do to this very day.
Yeah.
Took a dark turn to burner phones there. Cool. All right, well, we're nearly at 2 hours. Thank you very much for coming in, Mike. It's great to meet you at long last, having interacted with you electronically.
Wait.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And that's 2 hours.
And that's 2 hours. Okay, well,
That is one of the longest ones then.
it is. Well, it's fitting. It's the last one we're going to do for a while, so it's fine that we banged on for a little bit.
Let's do 2 more. Let's do 2 more. 2 more hours.
2 more hours. Oh my God.
I can't believe it's been 2 hours. It's not felt anything like that.
Flies by. I can't believe I need a slash again. Jesus, good thing I went last time.
I can't believe I didn't need to go.
But yeah, so that's it. So thanks again, Mike. It was great chatting to you, and you know we'll arrange it for sometime in the future, especially if there's any sort of significant developments in what you do. But also, if you just give us one of your big comments on our story, we might get you on to explain yourself. So it's great to meet you, and thanks a lot. And you know, for people like Mike, you're just going to have to find meaning in your life without us for the next month or so.
Just go through the catalogue.
Yeah, just go through the back
At least you
catalogue.
can go down the pub these
Greatest hits.
Yeah.
At least you can get the pub. So yeah, thank you for listening, and sit tight, and we'll be back in a month or so. Cheers.